So yeah, Awatif Mohamad worked with us at Coventry HDRC as a volunteer a few months ago, where she supported a project which was actually commissioned by Amanda King, who's I know is in the group here. Yeah, Tiff's got a background in psychology, graduated from University of Warwick, and has a varied experience in psychological services and research. So yeah, we're really pleased to give Tiff the opportunity to do some experience with us, and I think this is a really good example of how that can be really impactful and useful. So I don't think I even introduced myself, but I'm John Wilcox. I'm head of the HDRC team. So what I will do now is hand over to yourself, Tiff, to go through the presentation. As I said, if anyone has got any questions that arise, feel free to put them in the chat, or at the end of the presentation, I'll give the opportunity for anybody to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being patient as I through the technical difficulties. As John said, I did volunteer at Coventry HDRC for a short period, focusing on a project to support the Best Start in Life strategy with the early years team and the HDRC. So I was supervised by the lovely Dr. Chloe Ryder. I don't know if she's in full on this call today, but I know Amanda King is as well, and I was also supervised by her. So they also together proposed this project to me, influential factors in childhood development. And the aim of this project was to understand the specific factors that affected child development in Coventry with a focus on gender differences. So why research child development? Why is it so important? So it's been found that child development, even in the early stages from birth to 5 years old, can actually impact later life outcomes, such as, education attainment, income, as well as physical health and well-being. And socioeconomic status can also influence child development, with research showing that children with a lower household income being approximately 5 months behind than their peers developmentally. And seeing as child development is increasing and has increased to 22% in the UK, according to the Marmite review in 2020, this does highlight a potential concern for child development. So following this finding, however, the government has announced a plan for change, which calls to prioritise children's well-being and also aims to have children school ready by 2028. And of course, different strategies and initiatives have been laid out to achieve this, some of which have already been made into effect. As a lot of you may know, for example, eligible working parents have been able to receive 30 hours of funded childcare a week once their child turns 9 months old. And the Best Start in Life priority has been adopted by local authorities too. For example, Coventry City Council has proposed a focus to reduce inequalities in children's early development, including physical and emotional health, as well as cognitive, linguistic, and social skills as well. But how is child development measured, and how are the government and local authorities measuring progress for their Best Start in Life priority? Well, the Early Years Foundation Stage Statutory Framework, bit hard to say, while this framework sets standards for child development between the ages of 1 to 5 years old, and this framework also uses early learning goals as a benchmark for assessing children's progress, which includes 7 areas, which includes the following. Unfortunately, the graphics didn't show up on for all of the goals, but includes goals such as communication, language, personal and social, emotional development, physical development, and so on. However, the government and local authorities measure some of these areas before a child starts school to determine school readiness, which is also known as good level of development. So let's see if it does this. Oh, yes. The animation worked. So excluding understanding the world and expressive arts and designs, and leaving the remaining 5 early learning goals, we have what is known as school readiness or good level of development, as I mentioned before. So there is existing and growing evidence into factors affecting child development, ranging from biological, social, and environmental factors. For example, social economic status. And as mentioned previously, socioeconomic status can play a role in child development, again, with studies finding that children from a lower SES background are more likely to be behind in their developmental goals than their peers. But this could also be explained by other factors, making the relationship more complex. For example, children are less likely to access children from a low SES background, are less likely to have access to certain resources that affect their development. For example, nutritious foods and sensory rich environments as well. Let's see if it will neatly go over. Oh, yes. And gender. Gender also appears to have an influential role in child development, with girls typically showing better good level of development scores than boys. In other words, girls tend to show more school readiness than boys as well. So again, this could be explained by other factors. For instance, executive function have been found to differ between between genders. So executive function can be defined as one's ability to plan, to retain instructions, self-regulate, as well as maintain focus. And as you can imagine, these skills are quite important for child development and, I guess, achieving a good level of development. So you can see how gender and then the executive function can lead into school readiness and how that's all interconnected. And of course, there are a lot of different factors that have been found to potentially influence child development. And whilst there is existing evidence on, these influential factors, I think it's important to investigate this in the specific context of Coventry, which leads us to our research questions. So this project set out to answer these questions. So what factors contribute to gender differences in early years development in Coventry, and which early learning goals show the most significant gender gaps in achieving a good level of development, and how do these vary by certain factors, so ethnicity, deprivation, SEND and ELA, SEND meaning special educational needs and ELA meaning English as an additional language. So the reason for the gender different focus actually was derived by previous Coventry City Council data, whereby gender differences were rather pronounced, with girls showing better good level of development rates than boys. And so with these findings from previous reports, it seemed logical to explore these differences in gender further. So in terms of the methods and the methodology, I carried out a secondary data analysis. So I didn't collect the data. The data was actually provided by Coventry City Council. I was allowed access to their early years data dashboard. And I focus on children in the academic year of 2025. So in terms of my measures, they included whether a child was on track or not on track in their child developmental goals. In other words, whether a child achieved a good level of development or they didn't. And my other measure was whether a child was on track or not on track in their specific early learning goals. So these measures were collected as part of of the early years foundation stage profile assessment, which is a compulsory assessment for every child in the academic year that they turn 5 years old. And I believe that children's and other teaching practitioners within their school would collect this data and then submit it to their local authorities. And the factors that I focused on in this study include the following. So gender, of course, deprivation, So in this study, we categorized this as whether the child would be eligible for free school meals. I also looked at the ethnicity as a factor, ward, English as additional language, and special educational needs. The overall sample size consisted of 4,239 children, of which 2,088 were girls and 2,151 were boys. And in terms of the analysis, I did intend to analyze the data using statistical analysis software, so SPSS, but unfortunately, as the data was aggregated, the software really didn't like that. So it spat out different data that didn't really make sense, or findings that didn't really make sense. So I had to sort of manually go through the data and look at the results manually that way. But now on to the exciting bit. So depending on what you find exciting, I guess, but I think if we're all here, we find findings quite interesting. But before we get into the findings for the main research questions, I thought it'd be quite insightful to look at the overall good level of development rates. So the pie chart on the left shows that 65.25% of children in Coventry in the year of 2025 have been found to be on track for a good level of development and is school ready, whilst 34.75% were found to be not on track. And the bar chart on the right demonstrates the percentage of children that are on track in each specific early learning goals. So physical development showed the highest overall good level of development rates at 83.94%, whilst literacy showed the lowest rate at 66.83%. And I thought it'd also be quite interesting to see the rates according to ward. I know Amanda King was quite excited about this figure. So I found that 11 out of the 19 wards in Coventry are meeting or have met in 2025 the average rate of attaining a good level of development in overall, or even exceeded that, which is really good news. But that does mean that 8 wards have not met this average, which include wards such as St Michael's, Falls Hill, and Holbrooks, just to list a few of them out. And in terms of the overall gender differences, my study found that there are gender differences in achieving a good level of development in Coventry. Unfortunately, you can't see the numbers there, but it demonstrates that more girls are more on track for a good level of development than boys. And the gender gap in achieving a good level of development was actually 14.2%. And that's an important number moving on, as I use this number as almost a control, since I was unable to do statistical analysis. So I use 14.2% as a control to compare the gender gaps of other populations, as you'll come to see. So moving on to the first research question, which was what factors contribute to gender differences in early years in Coventry. So it was found that white children show the largest gender gap at 17.2%, followed by Asian children, Black, mixed, and other ethnic groups. And due to that variation, this suggests that ethnicity may play some role in gender differences in early development. Regarding ward, if you can see there, the gender gap did vary across wards. So for example, Wayne Body, if I can see it, Wayne Body here, here you go, showed the smallest gender gap in good level of development at 4.2%, whilst Holbrooks over here has the highest gender gap at 23.6%. So you can see how much the gender gap varies. But if we see here, we can see actually 6 out of the 19 wards exceed the average gender gap of 14.2%. So, for example, Holbrooks, Longford, Sherborne, and so on. And these particular wards show larger gender differences, all of which favour girls. And as demonstrated in this variation, it's therefore likely that environmental factors such as ward may contribute to gender differences in attaining a good level of development in Coventry. So now looking at factors such as SEN, deprivation, and English as an additional language, gender gaps across these populations are relatively similar to the control of 14.2%. So in fact, for these populations, what I've done here is I've not only compared them to the overall gender gap, so what I'm using as a control at 14.2%, but I also compared it to their peers. So for SEN, for children, so I compared them to also children that don't have SEN support, and for deprived children, I compared them to their non-deprived peers. And you can see actually, in fact, only SEN children showed a higher gender gap than their non-SEN peers. So this suggests that SEN deprivation and ELA have little contribution to gender differences in good level of development and school readiness, with special educational needs showing a bit more contribution than the other populations of deprived children and ELA. That is not to say that they don't contribute to the gender differences at all. Of course, we can't say that for sure due to not doing that statistical analysis. And so moving on to the next research question, which is which early learning goals show the most significant gender gaps in achieving a good level of development? Physical development showed the largest gender gap, as you can see here at 13.9%, followed by literacy at 13.6%, and then communication and language at 13.2%. But how do these how do these gender differences vary across different factors? So in terms of ethnicity, each ethnic groups do show gender gaps for each early learning goal, but physical development and communication language show sort of persist across ethnic groups. And this reflects what was found in overall early learning goal gender gaps as seen in the previous slide, but it does also show unique differences in each ethnic group. So these findings suggest that physical development and communication and language, it suggests that these two early learning goals may contribute to overall gender differences in the overall good level of development. Next, we can see here, this slide combines the early learning goal gender gaps for both ELA and deprived children. And as you can see, gender differences are apparent across these populations, again, in favour of girls. So for English as an additional language, the early learning goal with the highest gender gap is literacy, followed by communication language. This differs, though, for deprived children. So physical development was actually showed the highest gender gap at 18.5%, but then the second highest gender gap early learning goal was again communication and language, which then you can sort of see that pattern of communication and language popping up again as well. And then for SEN children, physical development shows one of the largest gender gaps at 15.8%, followed by literacy, and communication and language. Again, it's sort of there's that pattern that follows and persists. Literacy, however, is the only early learning goal that shows a greater gender gap in those not on track than on track. So typically in my findings, it was found that on-track rates were equal to or similar to their not on-track rates. So, for example, if you can see here, the on-track gender gap is at 6%, whereas for the not on-track gender gap is again 6%. But then for literacy, it differs. So for the on-track gender gap is 14.6%, but for the not on-track, it's minus 22.8%. So this suggests that literacy is an area of learning that special educational needs, specifically boys, find particularly challenging. So what does this all mean? I think it's quite good to do a brief recap, as I just spat out a lot of numbers and findings to everyone. So to go over the main findings, 65.25% of reception children have been found to be on track for a good level of development and have been found to be school ready in the year of 2025. This is actually a 1.7 increase from the previous year, 2024, which is very good news. And there is a 14.2% gender gap in attaining a good level of development in favour of girls, and these gender differences persist across different factors, particularly ethnicity, ward and SEN, and these populations may contribute to gender differences in early development. And in terms of the early learning goals, physical development, literacy and communication and language showed the highest gender differences, which was consistent across factors, but again did of course vary slightly depending on the factors. But I think what's important is to, of course, this study focused on the gender differences, but I think it's really important to bring into context what does that mean when you look at it in the bigger picture. What does it mean when you compare it next to the overall good level of development rates? Because while different factors showed varying gender gaps, some groups revealed high gender gaps, but a high rate of children overall achieving a good level of development, whereas there are other groups that showed, let's say, low gender gaps, but then also a low rate of children achieving a good level of development. So to give an example, in Wykin, 68% of children have been found to be on track for a good level of development, but there's also quite a high gender gap in achieving a good level of development as well, so at 19.8%. On the other hand, in the deprived population, only around 50% of deprived children are in fact on track for a good level of development, but they show a quite low or relatively low gender gap at 13.2%. So I think, again, it's important to look at both the overall gender gap and the overall good level of development, because by looking at both together, we can sort of understand the priorities and what might be needed for each population. So let's, give an example for deprived children. Their gender gap is quite low, and also their good level of development rate is quite low. So this suggests that this population is struggling to achieve a good level of development regardless of gender. So this may imply that both girls and boys need particular attention. And let's use Wykin as an example, as a contrast. So again, in Wykin, the good level of development rate is high, but then also their gender gap rate is high. So what does that mean? So this might suggest that while Wykin itself is developing well overall, it may be worth considering where the gender differences lie to further improve school readiness and good level of development. And I think, again, it's important to look at, overall early learning goal rates with the gender differences and look at them together, because while physical development showed the highest gender gaps at 13.9%, it also showed, in contrast, the highest GLD rate overall. And on the other hand, literacy and communication showed the lowest GLD rates. As you can see over here, they showed the highest gender gaps. And then again, in contrast, mathematics also show a low overall GLD rate, but then they also showed a small gender gap. So I think the point that I'm trying to put across is that it's important to really understand and put together both in context. We can't just look at gender differences, or we can't just look at, good level of development rates. We have to look at them together to really understand what's going on and what could be done to further support good level of development and school readiness together. So in terms of the practical implications, the findings do suggest that additional support is needed in early development with a focus on literacy, communication, language, and mathematics. The justification being that, if we just go back to the next slide, that these three show that some of the lowest GLD rates overall, if we're looking at each specific early learning goal. And with the gender gap persisting in literacy and communication language, as you can see in the different factors that we looked at, we need to really look at why this might be different and what could be done to minimize this gap. And of course, there are different factors or different explanations to why there might be gender gaps. But just to sort of explore this together, motivation and engagement might be a potential explanation. So research does suggest that boys tend to show less motivation and engagement than girls in reading specifically than girls, and in literacy. However, motivation may be fueled by gendered attitudes towards literacy. So the belief that reading is an activity for girls may be unconsciously imparted to boys by perhaps children and not by children, sorry, by teachers and other people around them. When this happens, it's actually been found that boys are less motivated to read. And research has also found that parents tend to linguistically engage with girls more than boys. And research has also found that girls have more favourable home literacy environments than boys. Sorry that they overlap. In my original presentation, they kind of like aligned quite perfectly, but you know, we make do. So in terms of the practical implications, this does make it particularly important to further develop language and literacy-based programs. I know already in family hubs across Coventry, there are a lot of language and literacy-based programs such as Playing and Learning Together, which is amazing. But I suppose we could consider and encourage different modes of learning and engagement, considering that engagement might be a potential concern or barrier for boys to do well in their good level of development. For example, action-oriented reading techniques or incorporating movement into learning could help engage children who tend to be more active learners, such as boys, especially in preschool age. Again, if we sort of like consider the gender differences before, there is that difference in executive function. So if we consider again the definition of executive function, it's the ability to maintain focus, to self-regulate. And reading and literacy-based activities in schools are typically quite passive. So this is why I sort of suggest that a more action-oriented or active learning approach. So that is one of the suggestions, but I'm happy to discuss this. I'm happy to, I'm very excited to hear what everyone else has to say about this, but that is everything that I have to say on my part, and that is my presentation. So thank you so much for listening. So yeah, I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Tiff, and I'm glad you got the presentation to work in the end. So yeah, I hope everyone will agree that's a really big piece of work you did there, Tiff. On how long were you with us on work experience?
Around like 3 to 4 months, I'd say.
Yeah, so yeah, a big piece of work, and we'll look to share the slides. Thanks for the discussion in the chat, and I think the other headline is there's lots of potential for further research as people have put some good points in there about other things that could be compared. But yeah, just want to reiterate, really impressed and happy with the work you did on work experience, Tiff. So thank you very much. Thank you again to Chloe and Amanda who gave you the support and supervision, and yeah, thanks everybody for attending. Look out for future Coventry HDRC webinars. Hopefully, if you know about these, you're on a mailing list. Do check out our Coventry HDRC website, where there's lots of information and you can sign up to a regular newsletter. So yeah, thank you everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.